Bible interpretation. We are free to illustrate biblical truths from scriptural incidents that do not teach these truths directly, but we should do so cautiously and sparingly. Here's Gene to explain.
I believe that Paul gives us freedom here to illustrate a biblical truth from an Old Testament story that in itself doesn't really directly teach that truth, but illustrates partially and gets a truth across. But I say cautiously and carefully because Paul didn't do this very often. And you'll see why. And here's the situation. Galatians 4:21-26. Tell me, you who want to be under the law, don't you hear the law? For it is written that Abraham had two sons, Isaac, Ishmael. One by a slave. That wasn't Sarah, that was the Hagar. The other by a free woman, that was Sarah. Isaac was from Sarah. Ishmael came from Hagar. But the one by the slave was born according to the flesh, while the one by the free woman was born as a result of a promise. So he's comparing the flesh with a promise. They were both born, obviously, through normal childbirth. One was a miracle. The other was a handmaid that was given to Abraham because Sarah couldn't conceive, and that was part of their culture. That's what they came out of. If you couldn't produce a child for your husband, you were obligated to provide a woman who could. That was in the marriage contract, coming out of the Babylonian culture. These things are illustrations, he says, and that's a key word. For the women represent the two covenants. Now here's where it gets a little strange. One is from Mount Sinai and bears children into slavery, and this is Hagar. That's the law. So he's illustrating the law. Now Hagar is Mount Sinai. He explains that in Arabia. And that's why we think maybe that he went to Mount Sinai when he was in Arabia for 3 years. And corresponds to the present Jerusalem. Here he's condemning the present Jerusalem and Judaizers and relating them to Hagar, not to Isaac, which would be very offensive to them. For she is in slavery with her children, but the Jerusalem above, namely the New Jerusalem, is free. And she is our mother, that is Sarah, who gave birth to Isaac, which was the fulfillment of the promise, and the seed was Jesus Christ. Now, when you look at that passage, we have a bit of a problem of Bible interpretation because the real essence of that is not really what is in the lives of those two women, if you look at the text. Now, he concludes in Galatians 4:31 by saying, therefore, brothers, we are not children of the slave, but of the free woman. And there he is using that as an illustration of what it means to have faith and be justified by faith. Now, if you go back to those two stories, we did this when we were in Genesis nearly 4 years ago now. There's a principle that came out of that story that is very important. In fact, two principles. One is, and that is, we should be cautious not to allow our pre-Christian, non-biblical values to cause us to make decisions that violate God's will. What did Abraham do when he took Hagar? He violated the will of God. He gave birth to a child that has created problems ever since. Ishmael. And that's part of the tension that still exists in the world. That's a very valid principle that grows out of the text. Another principle that grows out of the text, as I called it principle 27, we must avoid blaming others for our own mistakes. Why is that principle? Because Sarah, who it was her idea to give Hagar to Abraham, and when she gave birth to Ishmael, he became a problem, and she hated him, and she turned around and blamed Abraham when it was her idea. Now, rationalization and blaming somebody else is part of the whole biblical story. We see that from Genesis to Revelation. So there are two principles that come out of those stories. What I'm saying is, in a situation like this, we've got to be very careful. Now, let me give you another illustration that I think applies the principle where we can illustrate a biblical truth from an Old Testament story that doesn't teach the truth directly. How many times have you heard someone preach on David and Goliath, where he took there's 5 smooth stones, he went out there and he slew the giant? From there we say, we too have giants in our lives. That's a little bit of a jump in terms of the literal meaning. Although it's okay. It's okay depending how you define giants. Right? Now here's the point that I'd like to share with you here. The most important supercultural principle that comes directly from David and Goliath, which can be verified in the New Testament, is that even young people should seek to be bold and courageous in upholding God's reputation. What motivated David to go out and take on that Goliath? He was defaming the name of God. And as a young man, he went out there and defended God's reputation. Now that's a principle that is very clear. And you can verify that from the New Testament, because when Paul wrote to Timothy, what did he say? No one should despise your youth. Instead, be an example to the believers in speech, in conduct, in love, and faith, and purity. Now, see, in this whole study, we try to make sure that the principle emerges from the historical context and understanding of that text, which gives us a supercultural principle which can be verified throughout the whole Bible and the biblical story. In this case, we would say that Paul's hermeneutics, or his process of interpretation of a text, doesn't fit our standard for biblical interpretation. And yet it was Paul who did this, and I think that he gives us a sense of freedom to be able to do that, but we must do it cautiously and sparingly. Now, here's the question for reflection and response. What are some of the dangers in illustrating biblical truths with particular stories in Scripture that in themselves do not teach these biblical truths historically and textually? What are the dangers? Well, you've heard preachers who take something out of Scripture, depart from it, and apply it in a way that has nothing to do with the original meaning. Have you ever heard that? Now, what Paul is saying, I think, to us, it's okay as long as it's illustrating a biblical truth, but you better make sure that it can be verified throughout the Old Testament. If you want to use it as an illustration, like I did with Hagar and with Sarah, fine, but make sure it really illustrates a biblical truth. Now, that's why I add this note. Though Paul used this freedom in his letter to the Galatians, this was not his normal approach in using Old Testament stories. If you look at all of his quotations, that's not his normal approach. There are, however, now get this, elements in the lives of Hagar and Sarah that helped him illustrate the difference between the Old and the New Covenants. There were elements in that story that helped him to make his point. And I think that's another guiding principle as far as biblical interpretation is concerned.